Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English. We turn now in our novels study to the great adventures of Tom Sawyer. Now, this one is in many ways the prequel to, of course, what many consider to be the greatest of the American novels, The Adventures of Huck Finn. But we're going to spend some time with Tom Sawyer now. We're going to ask some things about the novel Tom Sawyer as we get ready, of course, in our junior year to read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We're going to ask some important questions, though, about Tom Sawyer, published in 1876. We're going to argue that this is much, much more than simply a book for boys, as it's sometimes been referred to. It's a book about growing up. We mentioned the word a Bildungsroman when we studied our Day No Pigs Would Die. We're going to see some similar kinds of things happening here. In many ways, all of these kinds of growing up stories track back to the Odyssey and, of course, to the story of Telemachus as he goes in search of his father, and, of course, he has to find a way to grow up and to become a man, right? This novel, Tom Sawyer, we'll call an adventure romance novel. It's a celebration of childhood and, of course, of the American village life that Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, is going to talk about. I mentioned Samuel Clemens. Of course, Mark Twain is going to be his name that he is going to give himself. He spent quite a bit of time on the Mississippi River and especially doing steamboat work, and because of that, this term, this name Mark Twain, will be important for him. Clemens is born in November of 1835 and will die in April of 1910. So he saw a little bit of the beginning of the 20th century, but of course he spent most of his life in that 19th century growing up in that area of the Midwest, as we'll often refer to it. He becomes a tremendous humorist and satirist, and we're going to see quite a bit of humor and satire in this novel. Tom Sawyer started out kind of as an economic failure, ironically, but by the end, Twain had sold more copies in his lifetime of Tom Sawyer than any other novel. Now, our goal here is to work through quickly a brief summary of the novel. Our expectations is that you are following along on LearnStrong.net, our other lectures as well, and you understand our learning theory, that connecting of new information to old information in meaningful ways, our 3 levels of reading. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? Themes, messages, 2A. Of course, the rhetorical level at 2B. We'll look at symbolism and irony as part of our study of this novel. And, of course, the big 5, as we often will refer to it. What does the text say about epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, and theodicy? And we'll maybe reference each of those in turn at the conclusion of our study. Finally, at level 3, how can I relate this text to other texts that I already know? 3A, and to myself, finally. And that's one of the beautiful things about reading Tom Sawyer as a freshman in high school, is that we just do start to get a sense of some of the insights about human personality, human psychology, certainly sociology, that Twain understood so brilliantly. Let's go through a real quick summary of the novel. Well, first of all, we meet Tom Sawyer. He is imaginative. He lives in the world of his imagination. And, of course, he's also, the word is often applied to him, mischievous, right? He lives with his Aunt Polly, his half-brother Sid, on the Mississippi River in the town of St. Petersburg, Missouri, okay? So he gets in trouble right away at the beginning of the novel because he plays hooky from school. That is to say, he skips school on a Friday, and he gets in a fight. He dirties his clothes in a fight. For this, his punishment, and this is if there's any story from Tom Sawyer that everybody knows, it's this one. He has to whitewash the fence. And of course, this punishment on Saturday when, oh my heavens, he would be obviously longing to be somewhere else doing something else like fishing or something, or playing as boys do. At first, of course, he's disappointed. But very soon, he figures out, using reverse psychology, that he has the ability to persuade his friends to, in fact, want to paint the fence. So he's whitewashing the fence. They come by, oh, what are you doing? Ha, ha, ha. Oh, no, no, no. This is special work. Only special kinds of people get to do this kind of work. Oh, no, 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 you can't do this. Really? I want to do this. No, no, you can't do this. He actually has them giving him trinkets, treasures, toys for the privilege of doing the very work that he's been assigned to do. Now, this is one of the reasons why we say this is not just a child's book. Because to read this book, and especially this scene, one grows to appreciate what it is that Tom Sawyer understands about human psyche. Namely, we always want to do the thing we're told we can't do. Tell somebody, you cannot do this, and that's the first thing that, of course, he or she will want to do. Okay? Using his treasures, he trades them for tickets given out in Sunday school for memorizing Bible verses, and he uses the tickets to claim a Bible as his prize. In other words, put it in your notes, Tom Sawyer is the great exemplar of a young entrepreneur. And of course, in some ways then, encapsulating the American spirit of capitalism and entrepreneurial enterprise, we might say, and of course individualism as well. He loses, however, a whole lot of his glory, because in response to a question to show how much knowledge he knows, he will incorrectly answer that the first two disciples were David and Goliath. And of course, readers of this book originally knew their Bible well enough to understand the joke. Unfortunately, many of our readers today don't know the Bible well enough to be able to appreciate the joke that's being told here. Tom in his love life. Well, he falls in love with Becky Thatcher. This is a new girl to town. He persuades her to get engaged with him, okay? And their romance is going to go great until he screws it up and he slips up and lets her know, Becky know, that his old girl was Amy Lawrence and he had ostensibly played the same game again. This is the point of this novel. The growing up process is a growing up of learning how to emulate in some ways, sometimes even imitate, the life patterns of adults, of course in really kind of juvenile and childish ways, all right? Becky will shun him, and so Tom has a response. He accompanies Huckleberry Finn, a pal of his, and of course the subject of the great novel Adventures of Huck Finn, to the graveyard. And there in the graveyard, they're going to try out a cure for warts, all right? They, as well, though, see something they shouldn't, and this will happen a couple of times in the novel. James Joyce, an important author for us as our senior year will unfold, James Joyce will argue these things called epiphanies, these insights, and these moments that you have, these important realizations, and one of these will start early on at the graveyard. Tom and Huck are going to witness something that they are not supposed to see. The murder of young Dr. Robinson by the Native American half-breed Injun Joe. And there's many have critiqued this novel harshly for its lack of political correctness. No question that Mark Twain, writing when he writes, is going to have certain kind of stereotypes, and one of those will be this Native American, this half-breed, as he'll be referred to, who is often drunken and very, very violent and very nasty. Tom and Huck, you can imagine, are scared to death. They will swear a blood oath that they tell nobody about what they have seen in this experience. Injun Joe is going to blame, actually, Muff Potter, this poor drunk, for the crime. And only Tom and Huck know that, in fact, it was, in fact, Injun Joe and not Muff Potter who, in fact, killed Dr. Robinson. Potter is arrested for the guilt, and then Tom's begins to worry, his anxiety, right, and his guilt as well, right? He knows that in fact it wasn't at all Muff Potter who took the life of Dr. Robinson. Tom, Huck, Tom's friend Joe Harper are going to run away to an island. This is the next movement of the novel. Run away to an island and become pirates, right? This is the this fascination with being a pirate has a lot to do with, of course, being outside of the bounds of civilization. You can do anything you want. You don't have to wear shoes if you're Huck, etc., etc., okay? They're messing around. They're enjoying their newfound freedom. The boys, however, do start to hear sounding cannon fire on the river, and they realize that what's happening here is that the town thinks that the boys are dead, and they're dragging the river to look for the dead bodies. Tom, always wanting to see an advantage, is going to then say, I wonder what it's like to be dead but not be dead. And so he's going to come back home for a night to observe all of the craziness that's going down because he's dead. And then he has a brief moment of remorse, right, because his loved ones care for him. And he's struck by the idea of appearing at his funeral and surprising everyone. And this is exactly what he does. So Joe and Huck will show up at their funeral, and of course, great rejoicing when they all show up. And then they become obviously envied and admired by all of their friends for having the courage to do this. We're back at school. And Twain has some genius moments in this novel in his critique of education in schools. Back in school, Tom gets himself back into Becky's favor because Becky will tear a book of the headmaster, and Tom will say, "It was mine," and he takes responsibility for it. Now, the centerpiece of this novel is the trial of Muff Potter's trial, right? Supposedly having stabbed Dr. Robinson. And of course, Tom knows that in fact it was Injun Joe. And so he comes forward and he testifies against Injun Joe. Potter is acquitted, but Injun Joe will then flee out of the courtroom. If you turn this novel into a movie, this is one of the pivotal scenes of the novel. He jumps through a window and out he goes, and gets away. And obviously now Tom gets to kind of live with this realization that somewhere out there is Injun Joe. Summer will arrive. Tom and Huck will go hunting for buried treasure in a haunted house. This is one of those things they love to do. Let's go on a, think of it. This is before boys had, and we would say girls as well, had the distraction of video games to put them in a place and have them play games. Instead, they had to go out and invent the games that they played, and this is what Tom and Huck will do. Hey, let's go find some buried treasure in an old haunted house. Interestingly, they go upstairs, and while they're upstairs looking through the holes in the floor, they see Injun Joe enter the house disguised as a deaf and a mute Spaniard. And he and his companion, this unkept, really gross kind of man, plan to bury some stolen treasure of their own in the house. Irony of all irony. From their hiding spot, obviously, Tom and Huck can kind of enjoy the prospect of maybe later digging it up. It's going to be an amazing coincidence that Injun Joe and his partner actually find a buried box of gold themselves. And then when they see Tom and Huck's tools, they become suspicious that someone is sharing their hiding place and carry off the gold instead of reburying it. Huck begins to kind of follow Injun Joe every night, watching and waiting for the opportunity, obviously, to get the gold. Meanwhile, Tom will go on a picnic to McDougal's cave with Becky, and this is how the novel will then end, and their classmates. And then that night, Huck will see Injun Joe and his partner making off with the box of money, and he follows and he overhears their plans to attack the Widow Douglas. Widow Douglas is a very kind resident of St. Petersburg. By running to fetch help, Huck will forestall the violence, and he will become in many ways an anonymous hero. Meanwhile, Tom and Becky, they get lost in the cave, and their absence isn't discovered until the next day, the following morning. And the men in the town begin to search for them. They can't find them. Tom and Becky run out of food, then they run out of candles, then they begin to weaken in the cave. And then the horror of the cave situation is made even more remarkable because Injun Joe is using the cave as a hideout, and obviously Tom knows Injun Joe would like to kill him. Just as searchers are ready to give up, eventually, Tom finds his way out. So this is, again, one of those examples of a young man who is having to kind of become, more leaning on his own abilities. He's got to problem solve. He's got to get out of some situations, and sure enough, he does it. And of course, the town will celebrate, and Becky's father, Judge Thatcher, will decide, you know what, that's a dangerous cave. We're going to lock it up. Injun Joe ends up trapped inside and, of course, starves to death. So we've got the balance, if you will. When we talk the Odyssey, we'll see this. We've got the balance in the end that the bad guy gets his. A week later, Tom takes Huck to the cave. They find the box of gold. The proceeds are invested for them, right? And the Widow Douglas then will adopt Huck. And when Huck attempts to escape civilized life, Tom promises that if he returns to the widow, he can join Tom's robber band. And in the end of the novel, Huck agrees. One of the things Huck hates the most, of course, is the idea that he's got to wear shoes. A symbol, of course, of somehow being trapped in the, in civilization's uncomfortable positions. Well, let's play around really quickly at levels 2 and 3. At 2A, let's talk Big 5 really quickly. Epistemologically, what does this novel say? Well, as a child, you think you know things, and then you come to discover that, stuff I thought absolutely certain, not certain at all. And epistemologically, one moves from a position of absolute certainty to a position of basic relativism, epistemologically speaking, and then finally, as one matures, one comes to that fallibilist position, as we've often talked about it, where one says, I think I'm right epistemologically what I know, but I could be wrong. And I'm always kind of making sure about that. One of the other epistemological truths of this novel is adults often do not like to be shown up, we might say, by the young, right? So Tom's able to, for example, make the teacher look a fool. The teacher obviously does not like that at all. Ontologically, well, this poem, I often call it a poem, it's so brilliantly written. This novel suggests that who we are, ontology, who we are, well, we're a whole bunch of curiosities thrown together when we're in adolescence, and we try and figure some stuff out. And we grow through those choices that we make as we become then the young adults and then finally adults that we are. Psychologically, what does this novel say? Well, the youth is a time of questions, and lots of questions and uncertainties. It is, of course, a time psychologically in the individual mind where one is trying to figure out one's primary motivations. Sociologically, of course, everything is dependent upon our neighborhoods, the cultures that we are growing up in, and the decision to conform or to not conform, central to a reading of this novel, and brilliantly constructed through so many of the powerful images of the text. Of course, deviancy is one of the central questions, along with the question of theodicy and why it is the case that some people have to suffer. Injun Joe becomes then a powerful symbol in that regards as well. There are several major messages here. Obviously, learning what it takes to grow up is sometimes hard, obviously confusing. The inner life of a child is focused and frenetic, and at the same time, right, so much all of those uncertainties bordering up against, right, certainties of a kind, all at the same time. The novel as well plays wonderful games with the idea of first love and how wonderful love is and how innocent, of course, it can be. The whole novel is, in fact, a celebration of the innocence, many have argued, of the innocence of America in the 19th century before the Industrial Revolution really took full swing and became such an important part of the 20th century. So much lost, obviously, in that regards. At 2b, in our rhetorical reading of this novel, well, we have several symbols. One, obviously, is the whole notion of the pirates as a symbol of freedom, that anti-civilization. No question that Injun Joe will become a symbol as well. Some have seen it as a symbol of the prejudice that's a part of, endemic part of the American culture of the 19th and early 20th century. The other thing we said we were going to concentrate on at 2b is the irony, right? Without meaning to, for example, Tom becomes a hero a number of times in the novel. It's interesting. Finally, at 3a, well, we mentioned this term Bildungsroman, this idea that young people grow up and they go through all these experiences. Dano Pigs Would Die comes to mind here of growing up. We mentioned Telemachus in the story of the Odyssey. I want you to put down a text that we'll mess around with later in high school. Cervantes' Don Quixote, and Don Quixote and Sancho Panza very much are reminiscent of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. I mentioned Huck Finn, so make sure you put that one as well in your notes. Arguably the greatest of the American novels. We'll hear more about that one on learnstrong.net as well as in the junior year. Finally, at 3b, a few questions. What was a time in your life when you were accidentally a hero, right? What was a time that reverse psychology game got played on you or by you and it worked, right? And what do you think that you miss most? I mean, this novel becomes immediately nostalgic in some ways for readers. What do you think you miss most about childhood when you were younger, maybe, and you had certain kinds of ideas that you now recognize are beyond you as ideas of legit ideas? And yet, what do you miss most about being a child and about having those imaginations as a child? Well, I hope you enjoy your reading study of one of the great, great American novels, Tom Sawyer. Thank you.